Chapter 5 of The Eagle, Saturnalia Games. Uncle Aquila lived on the extreme edge of Caliva. One reached his house down a narrow side street that turned off not far from the east gate, leaving behind the forum and the temples and coming to a quiet angle of the old British earthworks, for Caliva had been a British dun before it was a Roman city, where hawthorn and hazel still grew and the shire woodland birds sometimes came. It was much like the other houses of Caliva, timbered and red-roofed and comfortable, built round three sides of a tiny courtyard that was smoothly turfed and set about with imported roses and gum cistas growing in tall stone jars. But it had one peculiarity: a squat, square, flat-roofed tower rising from one corner. For Uncle Aquila, having lived most of his life in the shadow of watchtowers from Memphis to Segudinum, could not be comfortable without one. Here in the shadow of his own watchtower, which he used as a study, he was very comfortable indeed, with his elderly wolfhound, Prycion, and the history of siege warfare, which he had been writing for 10 years, for company. By the dark end of October, Marcus had been added to the household. He was given a sleeping cell opening on to the courtyard colonnade, a lime-washed cell with a narrow cot piled with striped native blankets, a polished citron wood chest, a lamp on a bracket high against the wall. Save that the door was differently placed, it might have been his old quarters in the frontier fort 7 days' march away, but most of his days were spent in the long atrium, the central room of the house, occasionally with Uncle Aquila, but for the most part alone, save when Stephanos or Sesistica looked in on him. He did not mind Stephanos, his uncle's old Greek body slave, who now looked after him as well as his master. But, Sesistica, the cook, was another matter. She was a tall and gaunt woman who could hit like a man, and frequently did when either of her fellow slaves annoyed her, but she treated Marcus as though he were a small sick child. She brought him little hot cakes when she had been baking, and warm milk because she said he was too thin, and fussed and tyrannized over him until, for he was very afraid of kindness just then, he came near to hating her. The autumn was a bad time for Marcus, feeling wretchedly ill for the first time in his life, almost always in pain, and face to face with the wreckage of everything he knew and cared about. He would wake in the dark mornings to hear the distant notes of cockcrows sounding from the transit camp just outside the city walls, and that did not make it any easier. He was homesick for the legions. He was desperately homesick for his own land, for now that they seemed lost to him, his own hills grew achingly clear, every detail of sight and scent and sound jewel vivid on his memory. The shivering silver of the olive woods when the mistral blew, the summer scent of thyme and rosemary and little white cyclamen among the sun-warmed grass, the song that the girls sang at vintage. And here in Britain, the wind moaned through the desolate woods, the skies wept, and the wet gale-blown leaves pattered against the windows and stuck there, making little pathetic shadows against the steamy glass. There had been wild weather often enough in his own country, but that had been the wild weather of home. Here was the wind and rain and wet leaves of exile. It would have gone less hardly with him if he had had a companion of his own age, but he was the only young thing in the house, for even Procyon had gray hairs in his muzzle, the dog, and so he was shut in on himself, and though he did not know it, he was bitterly lonely. There was just one gleam of light for him in the darkness of that autumn. Not long after he came to Caliva, he'd had word from Cassius that henceforth the standard of the Gaulish Fourth would have its gilded laurel wreath to carry on parade, and a little later there came to Marcus himself the award of a military bracelet, which was a thing that he had never for an instant expected. This was not, as the various crowns were, purely a gallantry award. Rather, it was given for the same qualities which had earned for the Second Legion its titles Pia Fidelis, for faithfulness, I think. Those titles which were cut deep onto the heavy golden bracelet under the Capricorn badge of the Legion. From the day that it came to him, it was never off Marcus's wrist, and yet it meant rather less to him than the knowledge that his old cohort had won its first laurels. The days grew shorter and the nights longer, and presently it was the night of the winter solstice. We celebrate the winter solstice on December 21st. Although for them, it's actually on Christmas Day, the 25th. A fitting night for the dark turn of the year, Marcus thought. The inevitable wind was roaring up through the forest of Spinai below the old British ramparts, driving with it squalls of sleet that spattered against the windows. In the atrium it was warm, for whatever the peculiarities of Uncle Aquila's house, the hypocausts worked perfectly. So underneath their floors, there's an area of a hollow area where they would keep hot with fires and stuff, specifically under the bath area to keep the bath warm. So whatever the peculiarities of his house, that part worked perfectly. And for the pleasant look of it, rather than for need, the fire of wild cherry logs on charcoal burned in the brazier hearth, filling the long room with faint aromatic scent. The light from the single bronze lamp falling in a golden pool over the group before the hearth scarcely touched to the lime-washed walls, and left the far end of the room in crowding shadows, save for the gleam of light that always burned before the shrine of the household gods. Marcus lay propped on one elbow on his usual couch. Uncle Aquila sat opposite to him in his great cross-legged chair, and beside them, outstretched on the warm tessellated floor, Procyon the wolfhound. Uncle Aquila was huge. That had been the first thing Marcus noticed about him, and he noticed it still. His joints appeared to be loosely strung together as if with wet leather. His head, with its bald, freckled top, and his bony, beautiful hands were big even in proportion to the rest of him. And authority seemed to hang on him in easy and accustomed folds like his toga. Even allowing for their 20 years of difference in age, he was not in the least like Marcus's father, but Marcus had long ago ceased to think of him like or unlike anyone. He was simply Uncle Aquila. The evening meal was over, and old Stephanos had set out a draughts board on the table between Marcus and his uncle, and gone his way. In the lamplight, the ivory and ebony squares shone vividly, white and black. Think of a chessboard. Something like that. Uncle Aquila's men were already in place, but Marcus had been slower because he was thinking of something else. He set down his last ivory man with a little click and said, "Ulpius was here this morning." "Ah, our fat physician," said Uncle Aquila, his hand, which had been poised for an opening move, returning to the arm of his chair. "Had he anything to say worth listening to?" "Only the usual things, that I must wait and wait." Suddenly Marcus exploded between misery and laughter. "He said I must have a little patience, and called me his dear young man, and wagged a scented fat finger under my nose. He is like the white pulpy thing that one finds under stones." "So," agreed Uncle Aquila, "nonetheless, you must wait, there being no help for it." Marcus looked up from the board. "There's the rub. How long can I wait?" Said Uncle Aquila. "I have been here 2 months now, and we have never spoken of the future. I have put it off from one visit of that pot-bellied leech to the next, because I have never thought of any life but following the eagles, and I do not quite know how to begin." He smiled at his uncle apologetically. "But we must discuss it sometime." "Sometime, yes, but not now. No need to trouble about the future until that leg will carry you." "But Mithras knows how long that will be. Do you not see, sir? I cannot go on foisting myself on you indefinitely." "Oh, my good lad, do not try to be such a fool," snapped Uncle Aquila. But his eyes, under their jet of brow, were unexpectedly kind. "I am not a rich man, but neither am I so poor that I cannot afford to add a kinsman to my household. You do not get in my way. To be perfectly honest, I forget your existence rather more than half the time. You play a reasonably good game of draughts. Naturally, you will stay here, unless, of course," he leaned forward abruptly. "Is it that you would rather go home?" "Home?" Marcus echoed. "Yes, I suppose you still have a home with that peculiarly foolish sister of mine, and with uncle by marriage Tullus Lepidus." Marcus's head went up, his black brows twitching almost to a meeting point above the nose, which looked suddenly as though there were a very bad smell under it. I'd sooner sit on Tiberside and beg my bread from the slum women when they come to fill their water pots. So, Uncle Aquila nodded his huge head. And now, that being settled, shall we play? He made the opening move, and Marcus answered it. For a while they played in silence. The lamplit room was a shell of quiet amid this wild sea roaring of the wind. The small saffron flames whispered in the brazier, and a burned cherry log collapsed with a tensely rustle into the red hollow of the charcoal. Every few minutes there would be a little clear click as Marcus or his uncle moved a piece on the board. But Marcus did not really hear the small peaceful sounds, nor see the man opposite, for he was thinking of things that he had been trying not to think of all day. It was the 24th evening of December, the eve of the winter solstice, so we celebrate Christmas Eve on the 24th of December, and the eve of the birth of Mithras. So remember, his religion is Mithras, and one of the things that they celebrate, it's not actually the main thing, but they say that Mithras was born on December 25th. And quite soon now, in camps and forts wherever the eagles flew, men would be gathering to his worship. In the outposts and the little frontier forts, the gatherings would be mere handfuls, but in the great legionary stations, because Mithras was more military people would worship him than otherwise. But in the great legionary stations, there would be full caves of 100 men. Last year at Isca, he had been one of them. Newly initiated at the bull slaying, the brand of the raven degree still raw between his brows. He ached with longing for last year to be given back to him, for the old life and the comradeship to be given back to him. He moved an ivory man a little blindly, seeing not the black and white dazzle of the board before his eyes, but that gathering of a year ago, filling out by the Praetorian gate and downhill to the cave. He could see the crest of the centurion in front of him, upreared blackly against the pulsing fires of Orion. Orion, the star, whatever it's called, I can't remember. He remembered the waiting darkness of the cave. Then, as the trumpet sounded from the distant ramparts for the third watch of the night, that's late in the night, really almost early in the morning, the sudden glory of candles that sank and turned blue and sprang up again, the reborn light of Mithras in the dark of the year. So he has this memory of being in a cave, early in the morning, it's pitch black, the stars up above, with 100 other men. The great gust of wind swooped against the house like a wild thing striving to batter its way in. He's brought back to the current. The lamplight jumped and fluttered, sending shadows racing across the checkered board, and the ghosts of last year were once more a year away. Marcus looked up and said, as much for the sake of shutting out his own thoughts as for anything else, "I wonder what possessed you to settle here in Britain, Uncle Aquila, when you could have gone home." Uncle Aquila moved his piece with meticulous care before he answered with another question. "It seems very odd to you that anyone free to go home should choose to strike his roots in this barbarous country." "On a night like this," said Marcus, "it seems odd almost past believing." "I had nothing to take me back," said the other simply. "Most of my service years were spent here, though it was in Judea that my time fell due for parting with the eagles. What have I to do with the South? In Italy. A few memories, very few. I was a young man when I first saw the white cliffs of Debris above the transport galley's prow. Far more memories in the north. Your move." Marcus moved an ivory man to the next square, and his uncle shifted his own piece. "If I settled in the South, I should miss the skies. Ever notice how changeful British skies are? I have made friends here, a few. The only woman I ever cared a denarius for lies buried at Glevum." Marcus looked up quickly. "I never knew. Why should you? But I was not always old Uncle Aquila with a bald head." "No, of course not. What was she like?" "Very pretty. She was the daughter of my old camp commandant, who had a face like a camel, but she was very pretty, with a lot of soft brown hair. 18 when she died. I was 22. Marcus said nothing. There seemed nothing to say. But Uncle Aquila, seeing the look on his face, gave a deep chuckle. "No, you have it all quite wrong. I'm a very selfish old man, perfectly well content with things as they are." And then, after a pause, he harked back to an earlier point in their discussion. "I killed my first boar in Silurian territory. I've sworn the blood brotherhood with a painted tribesman up beyond where Hadrian's wall stands now. I have a dog buried at Lugavalium. Her name was Margarita. I have loved a girl like Leavam. I have marched the eagles from end to end of Britain in worse weather than this. Those are the things apt to strike a man's roots for him. Marcus said after a moment, I think I begin to understand. Good. Your move. But after they had played a few more moves in silence, Uncle Aquila looked up again, the fine wrinkles deepening at the corners of his eyes. What an autumnal mood we have wandered into. We need livening up, you and I. What do you suggest? Marcus returned the smile. I suggest the Saturnalia Games tomorrow. We may not be able to compete quite on equal terms with the Colosseum here at Caliva, but a wild beast show, a sham fight with perhaps a little bloodletting, we will certainly go. So remember, in the Colosseum, at this time in Rome, the last book we read had our main character as a gladiator. So we're going to have some games here with beasts fighting against each other, a sham fight. We'll learn more about that later. And so he's saying, yeah, we know it's not as big and grand as the Colosseum, but we can still go and have fun. And they went, Marcus traveling in a litter for all the world, as he remarked disgustedly, like a magistrate or fine lady. So litter would be 4 men would have poles, and in the middle, there's different types, but like really fine Roman ladies would, be all, propped up and proper on something like a litter. And so, Marcus, he can't walk this far, so he's having to be carried like that, and he's pretty disgusted by it. He feels like it's like a, fancy, fine lady or magistrate. They arrived early, but by the time they were settled on one of the cushioned benches reserved for the magistrates and their families, Uncle Aquila was a magistrate, though he had not come in a litter. The amphitheater just outside the east gate was already filling up with eager spectators. The wind had died down, but the air struck cold with a clear, chill tang to it that Marcus sniffed eagerly while he pulled the folds of his old military cloak more closely round him. After being so long within 4 walls, the sanded space of the arena seemed very wide, a great emptiness within the encircling banks up which the crowded benches rose tier on tier. Whatever else of Rome the British had not taken to, they seemed to have taken to the games with a vengeance, Marcus thought, looking about him at the crowded benches where townsfolk and tribesmen, with their womenfolk and children, jostled and shoved and shouted after the best places. There was a fair sprinkling of legionaries from the transit camp, and Marcus's quick glance picked out a bored young tribune sitting with several British lads, all pretending to be equally Roman and equally bored. He remembered Colosseum crowds, chattering, shouting, quarreling, laying bets, and eating sticky sweets. The British took their pleasures a little less loudly, to be sure, but on almost every face was the same eager, almost greedy look that the faces of the Colosseum crowds had worn. A small disturbance near him drew Marcus's attention to the arrival of a family who were just entering their places on the magistrates' benches a little to his right. A British family of the ultra-Roman kind, a large, good-natured-looking man running to fat as men do who have been bred to a hard life and take to living soft instead. A woman with a fair and rather foolish face, pricked out in what had been the height of fashion in Rome 2 years ago, and very cold she must be, Marcus thought, in that thin mantle, and a girl of perhaps 12 or 13 with a sharp, pointed face that seemed all golden eyes in the shadow of her hood. The stout man and Uncle Aquila saluted each other across the heads between, and the woman bowed. All Rome was in that bow, but the girl's eyes were fixed on the arena with a kind of horrified expectancy. When the newcomers were settled in their places, Marcus touched his uncle's wrist and cocked an inquiring eyebrow. A fellow magistrate of mine, Caeso by name, and his wife, Valeria, Uncle Aquila said. Incidentally, they are our next-door neighbors. Are they so? But the little maiden, she is no bud of their branch, surely. So he's saying, she looks like she's adopted or not theirs. But he got no answer to this question then, for at that moment, a great crashing of cymbals and a fanfare of trumpets announced that the games were about to begin. All rounded the crowded circus, there was a sudden quietness and a craning forward. Again the trumpets sounded. The double doors at the far side were flung open, and out from their underground lodgements a double file of gladiators came marching into the arena, each carrying the weapons he would use later in the show. Shout on shout greeted their appearance. For a small colonial circus, they seemed rather a good lot, Marcus thought, watching them as they paraded round the arena. Too good, maybe, though probably they were all slaves. Marcus was something of a heretic where the games were concerned. He liked well enough to see a wild beast show or a sham fight if it were well done, but to put up men, even slaves, to fight to the death for a crowd's amusement seemed to him a waste. The men had halted now, before the magistrates' benches, and in the few moments that they stood there, Marcus's whole attention was caught by one of them, a sword and buckler man of about his own age. He was rather short for a Briton, but powerful. His russet brown hair, flung back by the savage pride with which he carried his head, showed the clipped ear that branded him for a slave. Seemingly he had been taken in war, for his breast and shoulders, he was stripped to the waist, were tattooed with blue warrior patterns. But it was none of these things that Marcus saw, only the look in the wide-set gray eyes that strained back at him out of the gladiator's young, sullen face. "This man is afraid," said something deep in Marcus. Afraid, and his own stomach cringed within him. He's an important character, just keep in mind. We'll come back to him. A score of weapons flashed in the wintry light as they were tossed up with a shout and caught again, and the gladiators wheeled and strode on down the wide curve that led back to their starting point. But the look he had seen in the young swordsman's eyes remained with Marcus. The first item on the program was a fight between wolves and a brown bear. The bear did not want to fight, and was driven into battle by the long curling whiplashes of the attendants. Presently, amid a great shouting from the onlookers, it was killed. Its body was dragged away, and with it the bodies of 2 wolves it had slain. The others were decoyed back into their wheeled cages for another time, and attendants spread fresh sand over the blood in the arena. Marcus glanced, without quite knowing why, at the girl in the dark hood, and saw her sitting as though frozen, her eyes wide and blank with horror in an ashy face. So she's shocked and horrified. Still oddly shaken by that queer moment of contact with the young gladiator who was so very much afraid, he was filled with a sudden unreasoning anger at Kaiso and his wife for bringing the little maiden to see a thing like this, against all games and all mobs who came to watch them for their tongues hanging out for horrors, even against the bear for being killed. He's just angry at everyone. He realizes this is not right. The next item was a sham fight, with little damage done save a few flesh wounds. In the back of beyond, circus masters could not afford to be wasteful with their gladiators. So what a sham fight means is that they're not fighting to the death, right? Just a few flesh wounds. Then a boxing match in which the heavy cestus round the fighters' hands drew considerably more blood than the swords had done. So you've got something wrapped around their hands and they're fighting and they're drawing blood with that. A pause came in which the arena was once again cleaned up and freshly sanded, and then a long gasp of expectancy ran through the crowd, and even the bored young tribune sat up and began to take some notice, as, with another blare of trumpets, the double doors swung wide once more, and 2 figures stepped out side by side into the huge emptiness of the arena. Here was the real thing, a fight to the death. At first sight, the 2 would seem to be unequally armed, for while one carried sword and buckler, the other, a slight dark man with something of the Greek in his face and build, carried only a 3-pronged spear, and had over his shoulder a many-folded net, weighted with small discs of lead. But in truth, as Marcus knew only too well, the odds were all in the favor of the man with the net, the fisher, as he was called, and he saw with an odd sinking of the heart that the other was the young swordsman, who was afraid. "Never did like the net," Uncle Aquila said, grumbling. "Not a clean fight, no." A few moments earlier, Marcus had known that his damaged leg was beginning to cramp horribly. He had been shifting and shifting again, trying to ease the pain without catching his uncle's notice. But now, as the 2 men crossed to the center of the arena, he had forgotten about it. The roar which greeted the pair of fighters had fallen to a breathless hush. In the center of the arena, the 2 men were being placed by the captain of the gladiators, placed with exquisite care 10 paces apart, with no advantage of light or wind allowed to either. The thing was quickly and completely done, and the captain stepped back to the barriers. For what seemed a long time, neither of the 2 moved. Moment followed moment, and still they remained motionless, the center of all that great circle of staring faces. Then, very slowly, the swordsman began to move. Never taking his eyes from his adversary, he slipped one foot in front of the other, crouching a little, covering his body with the round buckler or shield. Inch by inch he crept forward, every muscle tense to spring when the time came. The fisher stood still as ever, poised on the balls of his feet, the trident in his left hand, his right hand lost in the folds of the net. Just beyond reach of the net, the swordsman checked for a long, agonizing moment, then sprang in. His attack was so swift that the flung net flew harmlessly over his head, and the fisher leapt back and sideways to avoid his thrust, then whirled about and ran for his life, gathering his net for another cast as he ran. With the young swordsman hard behind him, half round the arena they sped, running low. The swordsman had not the other's length and lightness of build, but he ran as a hunter runs. Perhaps he had run down deer on the hunting trail before his ear was ever clipped, and he was gaining on his quarry now. The two came flying round the curve of the barrier towards the magistrates' benches, and just abreast of them the fisher whirled about and flung once more. The net whipped out like a dark flame. It licked around the running swordsman, so intent on his chase that he had forgotten to guard for it. The weight carried the deadly folds across and across again, and a howl burst from the crowd as he crashed headlong and rolled over, helplessly meshed in as a fly in a spider's web. Marcus wrenched forward, his breath caught in his throat. The swordsman was lying just below him, so near that they could have spoken to each other in an undertone. The fisher was standing over his fallen antagonist, with the trident posed to strike, a little smile on his face, though his breath whistled through widened nostrils as he looked about him for the bidding of the crowd. The fallen man made as though to raise his hampered arm in the signal by which a vanquished gladiator might appeal to the crowd for mercy, then let it drop back proudly to his side. Though the fold of the net across his face, he looked up straight into Marcus's eyes, a look as direct and intimate as though they had been the only two people in all that great amphitheater. Marcus was up and standing with one hand on the barrier rail to steady himself, while with the other he made the sign for mercy. Again and again he made it with a blazing vehemence, with every atom of his willpower that was in him, his glance thrusting like a challenge along the crowded tiers of benches where already the thumbs were beginning to turn down. This mob, this utterly stupid, blood-greedy mob that must somehow be swung over into foregoing the blood it wanted. His gorge rose against him, and there was an extraordinary sense of battle in him that could not have been more vivid had he been standing over the fallen gladiator, sword in hand. Thumbs up, you fools! He had been aware from the first of Uncle Aquila's great thumb pointing skyward beside him. Suddenly he was aware of a few others echoing the gesture, and then a few more. For a long, long moment the swordsman's fate still hung in the balance. And then, as thumb after thumb went up, the fisher slowly lowered his trident and with a little mocking bow stepped back. Marcus drew a shuddered breath and relaxed into a flood of pain from his cramped leg as an attendant came forward to disentangle the swordsman and aid him to his feet. He did not look at the young gladiator again. The moment was shame for him, and Marcus felt that he had no right to witness it. That evening, over the usual game of draughts, Marcus asked his uncle, "What will become of that lad now?" Uncle Aquila moved an ebony piece after due consideration. "The young fool of a swordsman? He will be sold in all likelihood. The crowd do not pay to see a man fight when once he has been down and at their mercy." "That is what I have been thinking," Marcus said. He looked up from making his own move. "How do prices run in these parts? Would 1,500 sesterces buy him?" "Very probably. Why?" "Because I have that much left of my pay in a parting thank offering that I had from Tullus Lepidus. There was not much to spend it on in Isca Dominorium." Uncle Aquila's brows cocked inquiringly. "Are you suggesting buying him yourself?" "Would you give him house room?" "I expect so," said Uncle Aquila, "though I am somewhat at a loss to understand why you would wish to keep a tame gladiator. Why not try a wolf instead?" Marcus laughed. "It is not so much a tame gladiator as a body slave that I need. I cannot go on overworking poor old Stephanos forever." Uncle Aquila leaned to get across the checkered board. And what makes you think that an ex-gladiator would make you a suitable body slave? To speak the truth, I had not thought about it, Marcus said. How do you advise me to set about buying him? Send down to the circus master and offer half of what you expect to pay, and sleep with a knife under your pillow thereafter, said Uncle Aquila. All right, thanks. That was chapter 5.